Hi, here's Phil Caveney, and I'm going to continue with the theme in our podcast of veiled existential threats. And in order to do that, I have to talk a little bit about my own history and background and some of my lived experience. Well, I was born in 1944, as I said, I think on last week's show, and I lived in a world where nuclear weapons had not been used yet, but death camps existed. And probably the two absolutely totally evil thing are nuclear weapons in terms of what they do and death camps. But there's almost uh, a theme that I want to bring up to work into this. Uh, Historically, there's always been an idea that if war were terrible enough, no one would do it. It goes back to the Middle Ages, and it goes through the American Civil War, and it comes right up to World War One, where Woodrow Wilson, American president, talked about America, who did not, most Americans did not want to enter World War One as making a world making a war to end all world wars, and to a war to make the world safe for democracy. And that point of view is terrifying because it assumes a right, particularly on America's part, to intervene anywhere in the world, no matter what the cost. Now, I'm going to go back a little further again. I'm going to talk about the events before World War One. And the World War One was fought at one of the first high points of European civilization. John Maynard Keynes talks about it in his book on Versailles, the treaty that the economic implications of the Treaty of Versailles, and what what I want to try to do is show that war doesn't seem to ever end all war, but maybe fear can stop wars from starting. And I've spent a lot of time getting back into my research mode when I thought I would never do that again. But nevertheless, I did. And what I want to do is I want to draw away and say there's a lot of stuff going on and a lot of environmental indignation and rightful concern about things like ocean levels rising, any of the other geopolitical climatic issues that we talk about. But what I want to talk about is the effect that a nuclear strike could have on a city using any city with the proliferation of weapons around. All right. As I do this, I started to key up, and we are in a crisis mode right now between Russia and Ukraine. And what has basically happened is that Russians have decided that for Ukraine, which many people have never heard of, it is a country located on the south and east of Russia. It's independent now. It was a republic in the former Soviet Union, and for 300 years before that, it was part of Russia. Now, Russia was a great power at one time. Now it's more like an overly armed third world country that's got something like 6,000 nuclear warheads and 10,000 tanks. Right now, there are Russian separatists who are trying to make the eastern portion of Ukraine part of Russia, and and Ukrainians who want it back. The Ukrainian policy is to join NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the NATO doctrine is what they call a blank check, and it means any attack on a NATO member, and there's 13 or 14 of these countries, will be treated as an attack on all of the members and may warrant a nuclear response. Uh, Russia has said that Ukraine, being part of NATO, is concern for them to possibly to have a pretext to use nuclear deterrence to avoid that outcome. It gets even scarier than that. I think I mentioned in the last program that in a crisis situation in the late 1980, I think 1988 it was, the Israel and the Western powers had decided to use non-nuclear weapons to reduce uh, Iraq's nuclear capability, and so a Israeli surgical first strike, was used to achieve that end. Now, as Russia has been involved in a war with Ukraine for the last 6 years, Putin has made an announcement essentially saying that a non nuclear attack on Soviet nuclear assets would be a pretext for the Soviet Union to use nuclear weapons against their attackers. Now, if you remember earlier, I gave some figures about the effect of a even limited nuclear response. And before that, I was talking hypothetically about India and Pakistan, for example. But we no longer have to look any farther away because at this point, Russia is at this point, at this historical moment, as I talk, Russia has issued a almost an ultimatum saying without a guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO, the Soviet Union would feel justified in using some of their newly acquired nuclear capabilities to basically defend themselves. Now, have I made that clear enough, Brock?
Yep.
Okay. Now, once I started reading this, I really couldn't stop, and I'm going to be talking about this for time from the time when the war unfolds. But I think to myself, here we sit 6,000 miles away, or I guess 4,000, 5,000 miles actually, with a series of events grounded in probably 600 years of history that could affect the very various quality of life on our planet. Now, one of the things I'm most worried, I talk to people about this. I talk to some of my caregivers. I'm making a recovery from kind of a perfect storm of medical conditions, and this one of the students I talked to said, well, she hoped that she would die before anything bad happened. However, I talked to another young mother with two kids, and I explained what I have explained to you. And she said, what do you do? And I don't necessarily have an answer, but I am a literary critic and a science fiction writer. And one of my ideas is, I remember I had said the idea was to make, with some of the people who brought weapons into bear, was to make war unimaginably horrible. But if we make war unimaginable, then we simply don't think about it. But if a person with literary art and craft and skill, or a filmmaker could, in a sense, make the unimaginable imaginable, then people actually thought of the context of living in a world that was something like a site of The Walking Dead, then that might help. Today, I looked at some videos, documentaries about the history of the Russia-Ukraine war, which is really Russians in eastern Ukraine seceded, and with Russian support, they they wanted to be part of Russia again, basically because they were not they perceived in their mind that they were not being treated well by the president of Ukraine. And the present president of Ukraine is pro-West, and the previous one was pro-Russian. But so there's like a equivalent of the Western Front. That was the way most of World War One was fought out, in which a stalemate takes place, and people live in the soldiers that are fighting on that front. And so far, we've only got on our Western news information from Western journalists say that they're ready for the Russians, but they're living in a environment that's like the World War One trenches. And I think as I of that, it's 100 years later, and it becomes like World War One, only with nuclear threats. Now I have some other people I'm going to contact, physicians for social responsibility, and some other forward-thinking medical people, and maybe try to do some education, and to say, well, I did study this stuff 59 years ago at UW-Madison, and now it's 59 years later. Well, I buddy there, Mr. Wiggles.
Yeah.
And maybe we need Mr. Wiggles to cheer us up. But
Yeah, he never gets down about anything.
yeah, but I feel that there's a fog of information, of alarmists, and a nuclear war is as much a environmental crisis as global warming, and it's topped off with a nuclear winter. And so it's almost like putting together everything we would worry about for the next 50 years into the 10 minutes it would take for a Russian missile to reach Ukraine, or a Ukrainian missile to reach Moscow. And apparently, weapons technology has advanced quite a bit since my day. And I haven't even gone into that now. I don't know how far I'm going to go into it, but the there was a sign I saw at one of the Ukrainian trenches facing the Russian separatists, and it said, "Only the dead aren't scared." And as I have a love for younger people in my world, and my relatives and my friends, I really do not want them to have to live in a world of radioactive zombies. And I hope I'm not picking on zombies in some politically incorrect way by saying that. That's pretty much what I've got for now. And I hope that makes at least a little bit of an introduction for a show. And I'm stuck doing what I never said I was going to do again, which is bibliographies and scholarships. Going to raise hell with my chess game. So that's what I got for now, Brock.
Okay. Yeah, I
May-
wonder,
Go,
maybe.
maybe I'll call. Maybe I'll do some segments as I go along. Like we'll have the major show themes, and then kind of a watch on the something for 3 minutes as this crisis unfolds. So go ahead, Brock.
No, that sounds good. I was just gonna say, maybe for context, because I'm in my, well, middle to upper 40s, I guess.
Yeah,
And I can remember my parents talking about the drills that you guys used to have when you were kids, where it was having everybody duck underneath the
yeah.
desk and covering their heads, pretending the Russians were attacking with nukes. Um, but like people born not too much after me never really had a connection to somebody telling them that, like how that kind
Right.
of was for them firsthand. So I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, but um, kind of goes into our kind of your standpoint theory you were
Yeah.
talking about, where people kind of see things from their past experiences. So um, that kind of led us, each one of us, to pick the topic that we did because of our past experience. But so I don't know if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to touch on that at all, like how worried everybody was about it when you were, like in grade school and middle school, and these kind of drills they had you do and everything like that.
Well, sure. There was there was a movie that came out in 1960. It was called Failsafe, and the guy who wrote the book was Harvey Wheeler. And actually, I had the pleasure of having a couple phone conversations with him for another reason. And at that time, they were anticipating what might happen if there was a computer error in calculating a threat. And in the process of calculating a threat, we had targeted Moscow, and the missile was going to hit it. And the only solution was for us to bomb New York too, as a gesture that we weren't kidding. That was pretty scary. It was also pretty scary. There was a North American Air Defense Command base in Madison. And because Madison was a strategic target, we had sort of a special way of thinking about that. We knew that if stuff broke out, it was going to affect directly with us. My father was executive secretary of the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, and that was the state agency that had control pretty much of all forms of energy and transportation within the state of Wisconsin. So he was actually in on some high level discussions where things that were thought to be real turned out only to be a computer mistake or something like that. I think in some ways, uh, people have joked so much about duck and cover that they've forgotten that the threat was real. And it's sort of like who's afraid of the big bad wolf or something like that. And the big bad wolf is still out there. I may not have. I also now I'm starting to remember. Boy, am I glad you brought this up. There's an isotope called strontium 90, and uh, atmospheric nuclear tests were done at least up until the late 1950s. And so for a period of several months, I mean, you could get the medical information. It was dangerous to drink milk, and it was dangerous to drink a lot of other to consume a lot of other consumer products because something like I guess there were 700 or 800 atmospheric nuclear tests by the Soviets and the Americans. And I'm sure if you looked at that from an epidemiological sense, you would find evidence of those tests. I mean, I'm sure that the data is there, and I bet I could find it in not too many keystrokes. So I would say, yeah, we were thinking about it. Nobody wanted it, and and almost nobody could stop it. I guess the thing that hit me the most was undergraduate at UW Madison when they had a very good major problems of foreign policy program. And I I was a freshman in college for the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I remember that it was so serious. They mobilized the National Guard, and that meant that several Green Bay Packers were called up on ready reserve because we thought we were going to either be in a nuclear war with Russia or have to invade Cuba. And 2 years later, I was studying the event as as a major problem in U.S. foreign policy. And when we got into the terrifyingly close thing that had happened, they set up. You've heard of the hotline, the red telephone. That was set up as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I think that part of my theme is going to be to make the unimaginable realistic in the minds of the people we talk to, and maybe get some other people on. But it doesn't do any good if you just say, "Well, yeah, I'm opposed to all war, and that's nuclear war too." I mean, there's a difference between a really bad conventional war and an incinerated planet. Somebody said, perhaps if you thought about nuclear war, you might think about yourself as being something like the dinosaurs watching the asteroid hit or something like that. So I guess this is what we've stumbled into, and this is covertly a existential threat to everybody. And I wonder what Greta Thunberg, was that her name, the Swedish teenager, has to say about that. I mean, it's not as sexy as saving the seals or something like that.
Right.
But we're trying to, maybe maybe there can be some kind of a coalition between save the seals and save the planets, which means, of course, that I've got to stop making fun of them.
Yeah. Well, no, it is. I mean, I had number of thoughts, but even that Fukushima reactor meltdown in Japan, um, you saw a spike of thyroid cancer on the west coast of the United States, all the way across the Pacific. So something goes wrong in any of these places, and it can do a lot of environmental damage real quickly.
Yeah,
And when you think of, I don't even know because I haven't done the research, but when you think of some of the countries that have nukes, it's just, I mean, like you said, people have kind of turned into like the big bad wolf where they kind of think it's, whatever kind of
yeah,
thing. But I do know, even people up here, usually don't pay attention to that kind of thing. Um, they were worried when the little rocket man over there in North Korea was
yeah,
having the who had the bigger button contest with Trump, and I mean that is kind of scary when you think about that.
yeah. I'm thinking now of what do they call that? Uh yeah, I'm thinking about guy, people like Trump and the premier of Korea, whose name I can't even remember, and thinking of something that else that I'm very afraid of, and it's called malignant hypermasculinity.
Mm.
When they sort of sword fight with their logocentric rockets.
Yeah,
I actually got
yeah.
a chance to use that word. Now, one of the things we're going to try to do with this project is include other people. And right now, I got a retired electrical engineer who's digging a trench so that I can have an electric garage opener. And he was talking to me about the Fukushima reaction a couple days ago. If he comes in with a shovel, I'll get him on here. And apparently, it slightly affected the tilt of the Earth's axis.
Mm.
I mean, but it was perceptible and it was measurable.
Was it from the tsunami that tilted the Earth, or you think it was?
I I think it was probably from the tsunami. Yeah,
Mm.
all that. I mean, it was. I mean, it's it's been a handful of years since I became aware that the humans seem to be the most powerful force in shaping the planet. You know, and that reactor collapse was definitely a human event. I mean, I don't know if it means that we can never use nuclear power again, because something's going to have to be used. But there needs to be some kind of policy and planning and some way of reducing the power. It's it's as if the corporate capitalism that we live under is adopting the idea that, well, in the long run, we're all dead anyway. So WTF?
Yeah, you only live once. Let her rip, right?
Yeah. Look, look at the fireworks. Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope I get hope I get a good seat. But you know what we need something other than sanctimoniousness. You know, I mean, we need gritty guys and men and women. You know, who say it's you're not going to blow up my planet. You know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess you could do another show, but it's kind of interesting how overpopulation of the planet kind of leads to us needing to have more more energy than you can just get obtained naturally. So if you got millions and millions of people stuck on a volcanic rock island, then they have to resort to nuclear facilities on a fault line, and because when you have people living, um, too many people living in a small area, then they got to get an unfair share of resources from the rest of the from places outside of their own geography,
Mhm.
and need to come up with alternate sources of energy as well. And in this case, it was nuclear, right?
Yeah.
But so yeah, so it's kind of like we're kind of drilling down and coming to some other things to maybe investigate at some point, like Citizens United we talked about yesterday, maybe overpopulation,
Yeah.
you know, exceeding the Earth's carrying capacity. Come up with a politically correct way to say it. Not that I care,
Well,
but
yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah. So it's interesting.
Well, I'm thinking the everyone was when we were back and capitalism triumphant in the end of history in TV PBS program called The Commanding Heights. People were triumphant about all the Bengali people who had been drug, dragged out of poverty by locating tech centers there and software companies and phone centers and all the things they did, so that the population of Bangladesh is now at 144 million in a country the size of Wisconsin. Bangladesh has a population right next to Russia, and it's going to be underwater. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
they didn't
I
get
see where
that.
you're going with that. We're going to have more people crammed into as land disappears. Uh, people that are on the land that disappears have to go somewhere, and then you get a higher density of people everywhere else.
Basic, basic. You know, we talked about Malthusian economics just briefly, and I'm going to give you the bet. The best social science I ever got was from a guy. I was in 11th grade, and he explained that Malthus said basically population increases geometrically and food size increases arithmetically. And at the time that he was doing his work, this was like 1820, and we've had a whole generation of economists say, "Well, that's wrong." Well, it's turning out now that I guess it's right after all. And the only way we really forestalled that was with huge amounts of energy consumption. If you talk about reducing the carrying capabilities of the planet, then it becomes more expensive to try to farming becomes like mining, for example.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. It ties into our show from Monday, um, because of the increased burden. Then you get all this growth hormone use, pesticide use, antibiotic use on the cattle, um, and it's like now you don't want to live anywhere close to a farming area because of all the toxins you're exposed to. And that just ties back into your Malthusian argument, where if you got exponential growth of people to feed, and you'd have like a more of a naturally a linear growth of ability to increase the food supply, then you got to try to find these things that are like cause like a multiplier effect, like pesticides,
Yeah,
herbicides, growth hormones, you name it. Well, they all come with the cost, right? And so some actuarian somewhere sat down and figured out the cost of the deaths and the lawsuits and everything else, is outweighed by the increased number of people they can feed, with,
yeah.
I guess, lower quality food. But yeah,
Did you ever have any? Did you ever watch the TV series Schitt's Creek?
I didn't.
I wouldn't really recommend it. It's horrible, but but it's funny as hell, and it's about he's a kind of a famous actor, and I can't remember his name, but I want to use it to make a point. And so he was like a billionaire guy who got broke, and the only thing he had left to own was a town called Schitt's Creek. So they were up Schitt's Creek because that's where they lived. But he's arranging for a marriage for his gay son, and they're negotiating about when they can have the perfect wedding chapel, which happens to be next to a pork production plant. And the guy says, "Well, one day a month we can give you a really good day deal on this." And so the guy says, "Well, fine, I'll do that."
Is that Slaughter Day?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and they're
Well, and not to cut you off, but just recently, the what is it, the ADA, whatever company is ahead, over top of agriculture, they now allow they now allow more hogs to be slaughtered per unit time because of the supply chain issues. So it's all like tying in again, Phil. It's all suturing across time, but with your trying to increase the arithmetic growth of the of our food, they used to have limits on how many hogs you could kill per unit of time and this and that, and they lifted it up now during this supply chain shock. So
and
anyway,
and reflecting upon that, as I guess we must. I wanted to add that just aren't slaughtering plants just a horrible breeding ground for COVID types? I mean,
yeah, I remember that. Early on, it was, yeah, all these outbreaks, and then I think some of them got sued. Maybe I remember hearing some of them got sued because they didn't really care. They knew there was problems, and they just wanted to keep it going. Um, and people ended up dying because of it.
are you are
Don't take away people's canned hams.
yeah are you are you familiar? I know you don't exactly like Ralph Nader, as I remember, but there was research done on the way. It turned out that Ford Pintos had exploding gas tanks.
Hmm.
A certain a certain number of them would explode, and the actuaries figured out the lawsuits and the cost of putting a uh, different gas tank on the Pinto. And they said, well, we'll just bury the cost. And of course, what they were doing was burying the victims.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, you see that in a lot of industries.
Well, do we that burying the cost seems to me to be another show topic we could get and pull up a few examples of this.
Yeah, I mean, the pharmaceutical industry would certainly be a good one,
I
but
bet I bet it would be. Do you think we should get some experts on this too?
I don't know who would be an expert on that. Um, the people who would be in a position to know a lot wouldn't dare say anything. But you can just focus on things that have already happened. Like maybe Vioxx. You just look at drugs that were taken off the market after it was found that data was falsified. To put forward for their trials.
It's it's
That's
very
just that's just a calculation, right?
yeah. Well, again, Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist that I talked about yesterday, was of the opinion that pharmaceutical companies should have no legal responsibility for any of their products, and that the market would sort it all out. But
Yeah.
if the people who use the product were dead, how would that work?
Then their heirs, you'd get a wrongful death lawsuits, but
Yeah.
uh, they can afford a lot of lawyers.
You know, if we're just playing around, hopefully we're going to get people who watch this and respond. But something like that in a medical sense, you might say, well, first of all, it goes from a line from a joke. Being a pathologist means you never have to say you're sorry.
Yeah, I bet you the malpractice insurance is lower, huh?
And the other one, oh yeah, uh, I can't remember it now. But that's being a pathologist means never having to say you're sorry. Oh yeah, I guess we could. Orson Scott Card is kind of a famous writer. I was on some panels with him, and titles for things are pretty much public domain, and we can turn that over to our legal department. But talking about medical stuff, we could have one of our titles called "Speaker for the Dead,"
Yeah.
and then put a disclaimer that we weren't stealing this guy's title. I mean, you'd never heard of him, right?
Right. Well, I think we got plenty of material going forward, don't we?
Yeah, I hope I wasn't overly technical.
No, I enjoyed it. Should probably get signing off,
Oh well,
but
yeah. Let's go through our let's do our sign off.
yeah, yeah, let's do that. So, you ready?
Yep.